This video was brought to you by Brilliant. The first 200 people to use the link below get 20% off an annual subscription. On Thursday, the UK held two sets of elections. Voters in England, Scotland and Wales went to the polls for local elections, while voters in Northern Ireland elected a new regional assembly. While local elections aren't that important when it comes to running the country, they're a reliable bellwether for a party's political fortunes going into the next election. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the results, what they mean for the Conservatives' chances at the next general election, and what it could mean for Boris Johnson's immediate prospects. Let's start with the local elections. Every year on the first Thursday of May, the UK holds local elections to elect some of its local councillors. In England, councillors are elected by first past the post, with each council split into little electoral areas called divisions or wards. But in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, they're elected by a system called single transferable vote. Across the UK, there are about 400 councils with about 20,000 councillors. Now, not all of these seats are up for election every year. Councillors are elected for 4-year terms, and different councils stagger their voting differently. For example, some councils put all of their councillors up for re-election once every 4 years. Some councils put half of their councillors up for re-election every 2 years, and some councils put a third of their councillors up for re-election every year for 3 years with no election in the 4th year. As you can imagine, this makes local elections pretty confusing, and coverage is always patchy. This year, there were local elections in all of Wales, Scotland, Greater London, North Yorkshire, Somerset and 2 councils in Cumbria. In the rest of England, only those councils which return a third or half of their councillors at each election were up for grabs, and these are generally the most urban districts and include nearly all of England's metropolitan areas, which means that most of rural England sat this year's election out. This urban bias means you'd expect Labour to do better in these elections than in national elections, because in general Labour perform better in urban areas. All in all, more than 4,350 seats in England were contested on over 140 councils. As councillors get 4-year terms, that means that most of these seats were last contested in 2018. 2018 was actually a pretty good year for Labour. Corbyn got 41% of the total vote share, with 32% going to Theresa May's Conservatives, 14% for the Lib Dems, 7% for the Greens, and the remaining 5% or so spread out across UKIP and various localist groups. Again, it's worth mentioning that, as in this year's local elections, the 2018 elections had an urban bias, which is part of the reason why Labour were 9 points ahead of the Tories. For context, the BBC estimated that, if the 2018 local election results were extrapolated onto a general election, Labour and the Conservatives would be level on about 35% of the vote. Anyway, Labour's solid performance in 2018 means that this time around they were defending about 43% of the total available seats. 51% of all seats available in England, 37% of the seats available in Wales, and 21% of the seats available in Scotland. The point we're making is that Labour were starting from quite a high bar this time round, so massive gains weren't expected. Anyway, so what were the results? Well, the first thing we should say is that we're writing this on Friday morning, so not all the results are in and we're yet to get any results from Scotland or Wales, but at the time of writing, it looks like a bad result for the Conservatives, a mixed bag for Labour, and a pretty good night for both the Greens and the Lib Dems. Let's start with the Conservatives. At the time of writing, the Conservatives have lost over 100 council seats, with the heaviest losses coming in London and the south of England. There were some pretty appalling results. In London, for example, the Conservatives lost councils like Wandsworth and Westminster, which had been blue since 1978 and 1964 respectively. They also lost classic Tory councils like West Oxfordshire, which was David Cameron's old constituency and had been Conservative for the last 20 years or so. While they've apparently performed somewhat better in the north of England, the fact that the Conservatives have lost over 100 council seats and counting in England alone means that this is an unequivocally bad result for the Conservatives. Now, you might be thinking that a bad result for the Conservatives means a good result for Labour, and while that's partially correct, at the time of writing, Labour have won a net total of nearly 100 seats. It looks like it's been a bit of a mixed bag for Starmer. Let's start with London, where Labour performed pretty well. They flipped Westminster, Wandsworth and Barnet, leaving the Conservatives with just one inner London borough in the form of Kensington and Chelsea. However, when you zoom out of the capital, the results are a bit more mixed. Further north, Labour made moderate gains in places like Dudley, Cumberland and Wigan, but lost a couple of seats in places like Hull, Hartlepool and Sunderland. Essentially, this means that outside of London and in the so-called Red Wall, Labour basically did about as well as they did in 2018. This is a marked improvement on the last couple of years, when Labour support had faltered, but it's not the sort of result that suggests that Labour are on the precipice of power. On to the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems had a pretty good night. At the time of writing, they've won just shy of 50 seats, performing especially well in southern Conservative areas like West Oxfordshire and Tanridge. They also made some significant gains in London, and some surprising gains in the Midlands and the North, nicking the council of Kingston upon Hull off Labour and winning formerly Conservative seats in places like Stockport and Cumberland. All in all, this is a pretty good result for the Lib Dems and will put even more pressure on southern Tories. And finally, the Greens. Much like the Lib Dems, the Greens had a good night. At the time of writing, they've won just over 20 seats, with gains spread evenly across England. In the south, they made gains in Exeter, the Oxfordshire area and a couple of seats in the lefty London boroughs of Richmond. In the Midlands, they've made gains in places like the Amber Valley, and in the north, they made slight gains in places like Cumberland, South Tyneside and the Wirral. So overall, it was a pretty good night for the Green Party. In summary, while it was a pretty rubbish night for the Conservatives, Labour failed to monopolise on the anti-Tory vote, which also benefited the Lib Dems and Greens. As we see it, there were basically two big takeaways from these results. The first is that the Conservatives really aren't very popular at the moment. Losing councils like Westminster and Wandsworth while failing to make significant gains in the Red Wall is bad news for Conservative MPs, and if the results in Scotland and Wales are even worse, Boris Johnson could be looking at a leadership challenge pretty soon. The second is the importance of some sort of progressive electoral pact. This time around, the non-Conservative vote was split relatively evenly between Labour, the Greens and the Lib Dems. If they really want to beat the Conservatives at a general election, they might need to start thinking about some sort of electoral alliance. But time will tell whether these local elections will have a lasting consequence on a national scale.
Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform that allows you to get smarter every day by learning huge important topics through engaging and interactive experiences. Gone are the long boring lectures that I sat through to get my computer science degree, instead replaced by puzzles and interactive experiences which teach you the knowledge you need to know in a way you actually want to learn. It really is all the knowledge you could need too, because Brilliant have courses from the very basics of computer science and maths right through to neural networks, quantum computing, and even quantitative finance to help you better understand financial markets. All of these courses are designed by award-winning instructors and built upon the principle of active learning, so you're gaining STEM knowledge by actually doing it. So if you want to improve with STEM, then you can sign up to Brilliant at brilliant.org/TLDR UK, and the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for supporting the channel.